Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville. It's a special week on the show devoted to another show that's been a year in the making. The Country in Our Hearts tells the story of how so many people from Kurdistan now call Nashville home. We have the largest concentration of Kurds in the U.S. We've spent the last 2 days in Kurdistan, but we turned a day to life in the U.S. Episode 3, The Safety Zone. Here's WPLN's Rose Gilbert.
It's my final night in Chalke. Tomorrow, Aran and I will leave the village and return to the city of Dahuk, an hour and a half south. But there's one more place to visit before we go.
Yeah, thank you.
The cemetery. Aran, Helene, her mother, a handful of the older aunts, everyone washes and dresses for evening prayers and then bundles into cars. As we drive out of the village, Helene hands me a purple scarf and shows me how to cover my hair and neck.
Make it longer on the right side.
Longer on the right side?
Yeah, are you right-handed? Okay, yeah. Like this.
Chalke Cemetery sits on the outskirts of the village, on a hillside of long yellow grass and twisting trees. As we pick our way through the headstones, Helene and the other women begin to weep silently. As the ladies pray, Aran points out his relatives' resting places.
My mom's, my dad's mom. That's my dad.
Some, he says, died in America, but had their bodies sent back to be buried in Chalke.
It's my uncle's wife. That's his sister right above him. So this whole area. This is her mom.
I can't read the names or epitaphs, which are all written in Kurdish, but his father's headstone, with green marble and gold lettering, it stands out immediately.
So his name was Naif Ibrahim Nouman Chalki, but he was known by Sayyid Naif.
Aran tells me he tries to visit the grave whenever he comes back to Chalke.
And each time I've came down to the village, I've been tied up or I've had guests, and just the timing.
He has so many obligations now. Family to visit, business to oversee, not to mention working on the new house he's building. Sayyid Naif died in 2013. It was sudden, unexpected, a massive heart attack at just 57 years old. And it was a huge blow for Aran.
You know, he was my role model. He was my superhero.
How does it feel, in some way stepping into that legacy, trying to uphold that after his passing and his memory?
He knew the culture, he knew the people, he saw the struggle. So to try to fill his shoes would be, I won't say a burden, but a heavy load to carry.
I can tell from my time with Aran that his father follows him everywhere. His stories, his accomplishments, his old sayings.
I remember what he used to always say. He used to say, your reputation is priceless, So you try not to break it.
They were prescient words that today Aran lives by. But he didn't always. Aran came of age in America at a tumultuous time in the nation's history, filled with terrorism, war, and so much fear. All the while, he was straddling 2 countries and 2 cultures. This pulled at Aran's identity. On one side was his father's legacy and his family's sacrifices. On the other was life in America, unknown and uncharted, leaving Aran in a sort of no man's land. As he grew up, these 2 forces pulled at him harder and harder until they began to break him and his reputation in 2. I'm Rose Gilbert, and from Nashville Public Radio, you're listening to The Country in Our Hearts. This is Episode 3, Safety Zone.
I remember riding this bike, the small little red bike that I owned. It was the first couple of years in Nashville.
This is Aran's very first memory.
I was probably like 5, 6.
He remembers riding down the steep hill near his house, the rush of it.
And I think just that hill was probably started a lot for me.
The exhilaration of doing something a little bit dangerous.
I'm not an adrenaline junkie, but I do like to try things, you know.
Aran was born in a Turkish refugee camp and was still a baby when his family came to America. First to Texas, then to Tennessee, where dozens of other Chalke families had resettled. They packed up their apartment in Fort Worth and moved into a modest 3-bedroom ranch home on the south side of Nashville.
It had a big tree in the front, and it had the brick wraparound driveway, you can't miss it.
Aran tells me more than 20 Kurdish families lived nearby, including plenty of family. As kids, they spent a lot of time at the neighborhood playground, playing soccer, basketball, and hojane, a version of hide and seek. He and his siblings went to local public schools with kids from all over the globe. Aran loved it.
I didn't feel being a different race in America. I always felt American.
Every so often, cultural differences did emerge, like during Ramadan, when his classmates would pepper him with questions.
Whoa, you mean you can't eat for the whole month? And then you would have to, explain to him, no, sun up to sundown.
But those differences never made him feel alienated.
I remember during lunch, our friends, they would not want to eat in front of us. There was still an understanding, hey, my friend can't eat, Or sometimes, let's say they'll pop a soda or something and drink it, but, oh, sorry, man, I forgot, I can't drink in front of you.
Aran says he didn't think much about his heritage or about Kurdistan. It was his family's homeland, but he was born after they left. He had never even laid eyes on it. That all changed in 1999.
That trip changed my whole perspective it changed my identity, I would say.
When he was about 9 years old, Aran flew to Turkey with his mother and brother. His father met them at the airport and drove them over the mountains and into Iraqi Kurdistan, a reversal of the route they took when they fled in 1988. Aran remembers staring out the car window, searching the unfamiliar mountains for answers.
But I remember I was looking around no, I'm from there,
Everything was new to him. The villages, the rough roads, the frequent power outages.
That's where everything started. Boom, then I started questioning, hold on, I thought it was from America.
He got to see his dad in his element as a Peshmerga general.
Yeah, I remember my first time going to the military base with him.
Aran's mom had packed him an outfit to wear for the occasion, a set of miniature soldier's fatigues with an orange safety vest.
The respect he got, opening his door and, once he comes into the room, everybody stands up and, the salute. And I was kind of starstruck.
As the general's son, that special treatment extended to Aran. When he asked for water, grown men rushed to get him a glass. And when he visited Chalke for the first time, there was a crowd of people waiting for his father outside.
I remember just looking up at him okay, this is who my dad is. Wow, I felt it was larger than life feeling, to be honest.
Aran had grown up on stories about his father. Seeing him here in the seat of his power, Aran had more questions than ever.
And then you become curious and you start asking, okay, well, Dad, who are you? What are you? What are we?
When Aran came back to Nashville, he felt changed in some fundamental way.
And I really put a lot of emphasis on, okay, am I American Kurd or am I Kurdish-American?
Kurdistan was no longer some abstract place. It was his heritage, his homeland, a place where his family was celebrated.
Maybe I'm not your regular kid here, Maybe I am blessed with something.
You're Aran here, and there you're the general's son.
Exactly.
He came home to Nashville with this new, burning interest in all things Kurdish. At lunch, he told his school friends about Halabja and Saddam Hussein and his father, the general. He was American, but he wasn't only American. Then it happened.
We heard this loud thunder. We looked up, and half of the building was actually coming down like dominoes, and it just fell over to the left, and that was it.
September 11th, 2001.
People still jumping out the windows right there. Still jumping out.
Jumping out. There are people jumping out the window.
Adon was 11 years old.
I was in school. I remember the teacher's name, Mr. Chappelle. And I remember it happening and everything stopped and him turning on the TV.
Sitting in class that day, Adon didn't realize the enormity of what had just happened or what the fallout would be. But it seemed his teacher did.
And I remember him explaining to the whole class, like, hey, look, we have people who believe in different religions and you guys are playing, eating, talking, laughing together. And I remember putting so much emphasis on that. I remember that day very, very vividly.
Nearly 3,000 people died in the attacks on September 11th. Thousands more were injured. And in that moment, a connection was formed in the minds of millions of Americans between Islam and terrorism. After class, Adon says the teacher, Mr. Chappelle, pulled him and the other Muslim students aside to assure them he had their back. At the time, Adon didn't understand what his teacher was so worried about.
But it was like a month or so afterwards, maybe more. I remember one night in Kroger.
He was on a late-night grocery run with his mom, a religious woman who has worn a hijab most of her life. As they went to check out, Adon says a stranger came up to them and started yelling.
That lady was like, oh, you're a terrorist. Why don't you take off your hijab? Go back to where you're from. And my mom, she could speak English, but not very fluently. But before she could even respond, there was people there. There was, Americans there to defend her, And then, boom, it hit me like, okay, this is what Mr. Chappelle was talking about.
Adon tells me the other shoppers rallied to defend them and escorted the woman out of the store.
That's where, Polly, it hit me like, should we go back home? Should we go to Kurdistan?
On the drive home from the store, Adon says his mom tried to brush it off.
Mom kept reassuring me it's okay, but I remember telling her, like, should we just go back home to see Dad?
He remembers seeing the fear in her eyes and wondering, what if this happened again?
What if nobody's there to help defend her, right? What if next time it's a man who's just ticked off?
Adon realized that, yet again, his family could become an internal threat. This time not because they were Kurdish, but because they were Muslim. The week after 9/11, Friday prayers at the Salahuddin Center, Nashville's Kurdish mosque, were half empty. Community leaders started telling hijabi women, like Adon's mom, to avoid going out alone or to consider leaving their scarves at home. People were scared.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
Less than a month after the attacks, the United States embarked on a war in Afghanistan.
Today we focus on Afghanistan, but the battle is broader.
A little over a year later, America turned its attention to Saddam Hussein and that now infamous phrase,
weapons of mass destruction.
Atomic weapons of mass destruction.
About weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Developing weapons of mass destruction.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
In February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the United Nations Security Council to make the case for war on Iraq and Saddam Hussein.
Most damning of all, his utter contempt for human life.
In that speech, he cited his crimes against the Kurds, Halabja, Al-Anfal.
Saddam Hussein's use of mustard and nerve gas against the Kurds in 1988. 1988 was one of the 20th century's most horrible atrocities.
And then he claimed that Iraq was harboring terrorists linked to the 9/11 attacks.
My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources.
And, as we know, he said Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction.
These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
We know now that intelligence never materialized. There were no WMDs, no real connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda. But regardless, the U.S. barreled toward war, a war that many Americans and the world didn't want. As many as 10 million people from across 60 countries took to the streets in protest. The largest anti-war demonstration in recorded history. Meanwhile, in northern Iraq, the Kurds braced for devastation. Fearing a chemical attack, people fled the major cities en masse, creating desperate, gridlocked traffic. People sealed their doors and windows with plastic wrap and cobbled together homemade gas masks from diapers and charcoal. In Nashville, Aron's family could only watch and wait.
The news was constantly on at my house.
He says CNN played on the living room TV 24/7.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
And I remember sitting down in my front on the couch when Bush declared a war on Iraq.
These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
The Kurds in the north feared these rising tensions would trigger another Halabja. So when the United States invaded Iraq from the south, it was a relief.
So you're overwhelmed with this sense of like, yes, right, this happiness. But then, it's like, oh, but my dad's going back to war.
The American military had a natural ally in the Kurdish Peshmerga, a fighting force of about 100,000, all with good reason to want Saddam Hussein gone. Aron says his father was stationed in Mosul, where Peshmerga and U.S. Special Forces won several decisive victories. U.S. forces swiftly took Baghdad, and then, several months later, took Saddam Hussein into custody.
And I remember being so happy and prideful that, it happened in my lifetime.
In many parts of the world, America included, the Iraq War is widely regarded as an expensive disaster, a stain on the United States' global reputation. But for the Kurds, it ended the brutal Ba'athist regime. And with that came relief, revenge, and a shot at independence. For Aron, it was a culmination.
Everything that my dad has stood up for or fought for, it's paid off. We're going to become a country.
The United States oversaw new elections where a prominent Kurdish leader was elected president of Iraq. A new constitution was crafted, one that officially recognized an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq. Aron watched on from Nashville, knowing that his family, his father, had helped make it all possible.
And then I remember walking so pridefully amongst that because it's like, okay, Saddam got toppled, and your dad's a part of the war, a figure that's known, and then you're like, you're ecstatic. Yeah, words can't explain, honestly.
It was an immense reversal of fortunes. After decades of failed rebellions and displacement and genocide, the Kurds were calling the shots in Iraq, backed up by their American allies. When Saddam Hussein was executed in 2006, Iraqi state TV broadcast the event.
People were having live barbecue. I mean, it was, hey, today's the execution, dude. Let's get together and celebrate.
It was a happy day for Nashville's Kurdish community.
People were dancing. I remember having this feeling of joy, to be honest. Okay, our oppressor is finally gone. Maybe did he get what he deserved, right?
I can tell Aron feels conflicted about cheering someone's death, anyone's death. But Saddam was the villain of his family's story, the reason they fled Chalke, the reason why his father was still in Kurdistan while Aron was in America, trying his best to navigate the world of a first-generation Kurdish-American teenager. And in that world, something new was forming, something that threatened to destroy the reputation that Aron, his family, and his community had worked so hard to build. More after the break.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org. Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Burr and Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com.
I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville. We're dedicating the show this week to a special project from the WPLN newsroom, telling the story of how Nashville came to be Little Kurdistan. We have the largest concentration of Kurds in the U.S., and their story has never been told quite like this. We'll be back after the episode ends with a few thoughts from the production team. Here's WPLN's Rose Gilbert.
What I'm going to talk about next is a sensitive topic in Nashville's Kurdish community, something most people would prefer not to talk about, to leave in the past. But this is a podcast about history, including its hard, complicated chapters. And for better or for worse, this chapter is part of the history of this community and this city. They called themselves the Kurdish Pride Gang, or KPG. Their color was a bright yellow, taken from the iconic blazing sun on the center of the Kurdish flag. They weren't really on anyone's radar, not the police's and not even their own parents. Until 2006, when a few members shot at a cop during a drug robbery gone wrong. That got everyone's attention quickly, including the national media.
Today, we take you to Tennessee. Police officials have linked a rash of brutal crimes in Nashville to a Kurdish youth street gang. The revelation has...
The group stood accused of some very serious crimes: drug dealing, beatings, rape, murder. Eventually, the city would even file a lawsuit, the first of its kind, to ban the group from a couple of local parks. I knew about the KPG when I started this project, but what I didn't know was that police claimed Aran was a member. Aran had never volunteered this information while we were traveling together in Kurdistan, but when I got home, I started looking deeper into the KPG, and I saw Aran's name come up in the court records. I realized that he clearly had another story to tell.
Well, now I want to talk about something. This is a little sensitive, okay? So I want you to be ready for that.
So months after returning from Kurdistan, I set up a Zoom meeting to broach the topic.
I want to talk about the Kurdish Pride Gang.
Okay, it was more of, it was Kurds, minority, growing up and obviously in America.
I can tell by his tone he's caught off guard, but he tries to explain.
This is a way of keeping our pride intact, keeping our defending each other. So, let us Kurds become one.
What did they feel they had to defend themselves from?
We have strength in numbers. This is a way for us Kurds to stay united, to defend each other, let's say, from the next gang or the next group.
Aran and his family arrived in Nashville in the 1990s as part of a wave of Kurdish refugees, which coincided with the war on drugs and the rise of American gang culture. These families settled here and enrolled their kids in public schools. And it was there, Aran says, where they ran into pre-existing gangs, competing groups with their own colors and codes, and they decided to join in.
Other people have their gangs, so why shouldn't we?
Why shouldn't we? Exactly.
Ours? It was part of a bigger pattern in immigrant groups across the nation who formed their own cliques. In Nashville, it wasn't just the KPG. There was also the Asian Pride Gang and the Mexican-American Brown Pride Gang.
And then, something small just grew bigger and bigger, right?
Members of the Kurdish Pride Gang have been linked to serious, violent crimes. But the KPG, as a phenomenon, extended far beyond them. The Kurdish community was tight-knit, and a lot of kids had close ties to the KPG, even if they weren't actively part of the gang themselves.
A lot of us were relatives. We were cousins. Many of them were probably brothers. It's deeper than a gang, right? It's family.
Aran tells me he was never officially a member of the KPG, despite what police claim.
Yeah, I mean, I was never fully associated. I never got jumped in, never this, never that. But I think what happened was it was like those rebel years.
But in 2009, Aran started getting into some real trouble. First, for trespassing.
Oh, okay. See, it goes back to, I'm telling you, this wrong place at the wrong time.
Aran says he was taking a shortcut through an apartment complex on his way to hang out with his cousin at a nearby park when...
There's cops circling, and then boom, I just get stopped. What are you doing here? I'm going to the park.
Aran says the cops were actually looking for his cousin, but he fit the description. He got a misdemeanor trespassing charge and was sentenced to 8 hours of community service, clearing out desks at a local school. From there, things escalate. Aran is caught carrying marijuana and for selling a small amount of cocaine.
It was just some quick cash. I was a good salesman. You know? Because you want the nicer things, you want the nice shoes, you want this, as a young teen. But yeah.
Did you have a pair of shoes you really wanted in particular?
I got them. Yeah, they were the Jordan 9s, the Space Jams.
That shooting in 2006, it was a turning point. Law enforcement started keeping close tabs on the Kurdish community. Aran says they'd post up at his pickup basketball games, 5 or 6 police cruisers, with officers lounging on the hoods, watching them play.
It made you feel like, what the hell is going on?
There was one man in particular that was all over the KPG, a detective for the Nashville gang unit named Mark Anderson.
He made it seem like there was a gang war between us and KPG and them.
When my producer and I started looking into the KPG, Anderson's name was on indictments, evidence logs, witness lists, reports. Okay. There, Detective Mark Anderson. Yeah.
Mark Anderson. Another Anderson.
Yeah, Anderson.
He was all over this.
And when I started making calls to detectives who had worked KPG cases back then, they said the same thing. So I reached out to try and get a police perspective on the KPG, how it operated, and what that moment was like in Nashville's history. Anderson's investigation of the KPG had defined his career for years. He won awards for his work and made some major arrests. But now he was adamant that he did not want to talk about it, that it was in the past, and that's where he wanted it to stay. In the end, he did give me a name, Dr. Kurmanj Gundi, a local Kurdish professor. So I made an appointment to meet Dr. Gundi at his office on the campus of Tennessee State University. The walls are covered in posters and paintings. There's a Kurdish rug hanging behind his desk.
Handmade. When you were in Kurdistan, you probably have seen a lot of this. You can find this in almost every household.
I asked Dr. Gundi if he had any idea why Anderson didn't want to talk.
Officer Anderson, he was showing me some messages he was getting from different individuals of Kurdish Pride Gang. Threats with his life, nasty words, using F words. There were quite a few of them he showed me.
When the KPG started gaining prominence in the 2000s, Gundi was already an established professor and community leader. Originally from the city of Arbil, or Hawler, as many Kurdish people call it, he was part of the earliest wave of Kurdish immigration to Nashville during the 1970s. His family fled after a failed Kurdish rebellion against Iraq, the same upheaval that forced Nash and his family to leave Chalke when he was a baby, back in 1976. When I asked Gundi about the emergence of the KPG, he called it the darkest day of the Nashville Kurdish community's history.
How can you be proud and defend the Kurdish community by being on the other side, the opposite side of the law?
As a professor, Gundi was a high-profile member of the community, and so he started getting a lot of calls asking him about the KPG. One of them was from Detective Mark Anderson.
We were in communication, close communication, to see what can we do to minimize the damage to our community.
Gundi helped the police build a relationship with the Kurdish community in the attempt to shut down the KPG. but even he didn't realize just how far the gang's reach had spread.
Let me tell you a story.
Gundi had a teenage son of his own. And one day, while eating lunch with Detective Anderson,
I wrote my son's name and put it before them. I said, if the name was familiar to them. And Officer Anderson looked at it and said, he is in our radar.
His son wasn't a member, they said, but he had friends who were. Gundi was shocked. The first chance he got, he took his son downtown to the police station to try and scare him straight.
We went there and they took us to a conference room. And after a few minutes, both came with huge 3-ring folders. Each says KPG. They came down hard on my son. They asked him so many questions about who they were, whom did he know about in the KPG gang organization. He did not say a word. He did not give the name of anyone.
Gundi says one of the detectives looked at his son and said,
"What do you all think of yourself? You can fight the United States." He said, in 15 minutes, I can bring FBI, TBI, local police, state troopers, and he mentioned all the police forces in anywhere I want. Why you think you can fight us?
The detectives wanted to make something very clear to Gundi's son. America was a force to be reckoned with. And from Gundi's perspective, it worked. He tells me that meeting, quote, changed my son. Over the next decade, Detective Anderson built cases against dozens of alleged KPG members, including a case against Aran. Here's how it happened. In 2010, Aran sold 0.5 gram of cocaine to someone who turned out to be a confidential informant. Aran had no idea at the time. Then, less than 2 weeks later, he got a weird request from a customer. It was a guy who'd bought marijuana from him once or twice. And now he wanted to buy almost $4,000 worth of cocaine. Aran knew something was off.
I should have listened to my gut. I knew, I promise you, I knew. I'm not gonna say it was a setup, but I knew something was off. So we ended up just putting flour in a bag, and before you know it, it was a CIA agent.
So he and his friend sold the guy 127 grams of flour, unaware that the customer was another undercover informant. Months pass, and Aran travels to Kurdistan to visit his dad. One day, he was out with his friends, playing soccer, when he got a call from his father, telling him to come home now.
And he was just sitting in his office, and he goes, "Hey, is there something you want to tell me?" He goes, "Okay, explain to me, why are there cops at my door in America?" And I have no idea.
While he'd been in Kurdistan, Aran had been indicted, and now he had to explain all this to his father.
That was the toughest conversation of my life. Yeah. I remember him just shaking his head because he said, "Isn't this something I begged you guys to stay away from?"
Did you ever consider not coming back, or was that just not an option after you talked to your dad?
I actually did. I told him, I was like, why go back? But he's like, no. He said, that's not the way I taught y'all. This is something that you did. This is something that you chose. So go deal with it.
And that's exactly what Aran did. He got a lawyer and booked a flight to New York City, where his older brother Nash was waiting to pick him up and drive him back to Tennessee. When they got back to Nashville, Aran first went home to see his family, then to Hooters, where he ate a plate of chicken wings, and finally to the police station to turn himself in. A little while later, Aran says Detective Mark Anderson showed up.
It was like 1, 2 a.m. when I turned myself in. And I remember him walking in, and he goes, "Man, you should be honored that I get out of bed from a nice sleep next to my wife to come see you."
I reached out to Detective Anderson to corroborate this account. He didn't respond. Aron took a plea deal, which amounted to a suspended sentence, community service, and a couple $1,000s in fees and fines. But it wasn't the money he was worried about.
Honestly, I was more hurt for my family than myself, because I felt like I let them down, Yeah, I wasn't scared, but I was very angry and disappointed in myself.
Then, some months later, after his case was all wrapped up, the police once again pulled up to his family's home.
I see 4 Chevrolet Tahoes pull up in the driveway. And when that happens, I run to the back door. Because, I'm like, I don't know. You're scared, like, what's going on?
As Aron started to make a run for it, he heard his brother open the door. But the officers didn't have a warrant and didn't try to come inside. They weren't there to arrest him. They were there to serve him a civil lawsuit filed by the city of Nashville against the Kurdish Pride gang. And in that lawsuit, there was a list. The names of 24 Kurdish men who were identified as gang members and banned from 2 local parks. They called this area a safety zone. One of the names on the list was Aron Ibrahim. The document describes a number of crimes allegedly committed by members of the gang, all centered around these parks. The crimes range from graffiti and drug possession to beatings, shootings, and witness intimidation. Aron is mentioned once. He allegedly purchased a box of ammunition that police found in the possession of a member of the gang. Aron strongly disputes this, saying he never purchased ammunition for anyone in the KPG. What was going through your mind when you saw your name on that list?
I was shocked, honestly.
Aron says not everyone named in the lawsuit was a gang member.
Or you feel like you just have a target on your back because you look at the list and it's some people in your neighborhood that you grew up with. I'm not trying to justify what I did was right. No, I know what I did was wrong. I know it's a crime. I know it was, something that I wish I can take back. But it doesn't justify me as being a gang member.
After the lawsuit, Aron got caught twice with small amounts of marijuana, including once in the lawsuit's safety zone. He avoided jail time, but got a GPS ankle monitor and supervised probation. He had come back to America to turn himself in and turn a new leaf, but he kept getting into the same kind of trouble. And now his name was on a very public list, identifying him as a member of a dangerous street gang. Then, one day in the spring, he got a call from a cousin to come to his uncle's house right away.
And then when I get to there and I see the house is full of cars and then, they broke it down to me like, hey, it's your dad.
His father had died from a heart attack.
You're lost now. Because at the end of the day, your dad he's your backbone. There's a Kurdish saying, we say he's a mountain behind you, right? He's your rock.
His father's death left Aron unmoored. He got special dispensation from the judge to go back to Kurdistan for the funeral. It was a big event, attended by all the soldiers and villagers Aron's father had devoted his life to. And afterwards, Aron made a decision.
I think it's best if I stay here and, I want to work on myself as well. Yeah, it's time for me to grow up and it's best if I'm away from there, because now that I lose my backbone and my father, what's going to stop me from slipping up again?
He decided to leave Nashville and move to Kurdistan permanently, to be where people knew him not just as Aron, but as the general's son. Said Naif's reputation is a heavy thing, but it's also a beacon for Aron.
I have to watch what I do, I have to watch what I say, I have to watch how I interact. Because you're looked upon in a certain way, right?
It's been more than a decade since Aron moved back to Kurdistan. And in that time, the Kurdish Pride gang has all but faded into oblivion. Meanwhile, Aron's taken over where his father left off and built a reputation of his own here.
The worst day of my life probably ended up being the best thing for me.
He's worked with international journalists to share the stories of Yazidi refugees targeted by the terrorist group ISIS. He's built a new home in his family's village in Chalke. He's kept his father's door open and his family's connection to Kurdistan alive.
I hold that with a lot of pride. Yeah, it's a heavy load to carry on your shoulders, but it makes you feel not important, but valuable.
Hearing Adon talk about being proud of his decision, I thought of the cemetery so many months ago, long before I'd seen the lawsuit, before I knew any of this. I remembered the sun setting behind the mountains, the women praying, the crickets singing, the still, sacred evening. And I remembered Adon standing in front of his father's grave.
I think so far, hopefully he'll be proud. Yeah, I think he'll be happy with the decisions I've made so far.
I'd asked him then why he'd given up America to go back to Kurdistan. Now I understood that it was a sacrifice, something Adon did for his family and for his father. But it was more than that. Adon's move to Kurdistan was a choice to grow up and grow beyond the mistakes he'd made in Nashville.
It was a fast decision, but I think it was one that I made for myself.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville. We just heard the third episode of Nashville Public Radio's new podcast, The Country in Our Hearts. It tells the story of how Nashville came to be home to the largest Kurdish community in the United States. Now, we are joined by the editor and co-producer of that podcast, WPLN's senior reporter, Merhaba Knight. Hey, Merhaba.
Hey, Blake.
So this episode is really all about what happened after a wave of Kurdish refugees arrived in Nashville. This was back in the 1990s, in particular, what it was like for the kids who were growing up here. Why the focus on that younger generation?
Yeah, well, we kind of trace the story of this one family. And so eventually this family seeks safety in America and they settle here like so many other Kurds. And the kids grow up, and so the story of that first generation of Kurds is a really important one because that's where, they're kind of caught between, as we say in the episode, like with caught between a country and a culture. I mean, they're just straddling so much. And it was such an interesting time in this country to come of age. If you came in the earlier mid-90s, and then by the time you're getting to 2001, September 11th, I mean, you're really in this very formative period of your life, and the nation is in a very formative period of its life. So it felt like a really important moment and generation to focus on.
And it strikes me that this concept of, are we Kurdish or are we American? I mean, only the kids would ask that. If you were an adult as you came, you would have no doubt. How did they discover their, Kurdishness while they were growing up in American schools here?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of first generation immigrants, like they go through that navigation of what am I, who am I what came before, am I what I am now, what's the future of us, and so we really wrestle with that with one individual character. And his name is Aran, as you heard, and he has a great experience in the public schools, but it's also he comes of age after 9/11, in this moment where as an immigrant from the Middle East, as a Muslim, immigrant, it's very different. This is a moment in time where we are pointing a lot of fingers as a nation at Muslims and at people that might wear hijabs or have brown skin. And so, there is some universal experiences that I think lots of immigrant families have and young kids coming up in the world. But for kids specifically from this part of the world at this particular juncture in time, it was a difficult period. They were getting a lot of mixed signals about being welcome, but then also, as Aran describes going to Kroger and having his mother get yelled at. It's kind of scary, I think for a lot of them it was kind of scary.
Well, looking back at the timing, and I think that's what's so valuable about kind of putting together this, decades of story all in one place, is thinking back. You focus on the Kurdish Pride Gang for a bit when it was making national headlines, and all that timing was sort of overlapped. I mean, I know that it was probably a little before 2001 and after, but one could see why you might turn inward and say, no, we want to show some pride. So, yeah, was that unique to the KPG as it was known, or is this just kind of in the life cycle of groups as they assimilate to a country?
Yeah, I think from our research, it was really part of that life cycle. It was a part of a bigger immigrant pattern. Like we said, there was, the Asian Pride Gang, there was a Mexican-American Brown Pride Gang. I do think that in this moment in time, you've got this kind of collision of young people doing what young people do, which is, not much impulse control, maybe not thinking through things, maybe wanting to be cool, and also assimilating in a way. And let's be clear, like I've studied a lot about gang culture in America. I worked in Chicago for 10 years. Al Capone to the Gangster Disciples to the KPG, like this is an American thing. Like gang culture is very American. And so that's kind of smushing up against these young people coming of age. But then also you've got this moment where they are feeling like extreme outsiders and they're feeling like they're being looked at in a very particular way, maybe in a way that's, are you a danger to us? And so they do go inward. And all of this is just kind of this perfect storm to create something like the Kurdish Pride Gang.
While it's this difficult subject and era in the history that seems like it's in the past, I don't know that the gang really exists anymore, but it strikes me that everyone's so surprised how many people are involved. I mean, Rose was surprised that the main character of her story was part of this. And then also this professor over next door here at TSU, his own son was on their list. So it really was present. When did you all realize this was an important part of the Kurdish story to tell?
I think we realized it pretty early on, although as far as like kind of being the editor, my mantra to Rose has always been like, if it doesn't intersect with your main characters, it's not part of the story. But this really intersected with one of our main characters, and it became a really important part of the narrative. But then it also widened the aperture of the story to say, this was kind of a darker chapter, but it also, it gets at so much that this young person like Aran was feeling. So we knew that it was something that we were going to research. We had researched it. We didn't think it was going to intersect our main subject quite as much. But I have to say, like, in many ways, I'm really glad it did because it opened the door to be able to talk about this. And I just want to say that, like, when we looked into this, it was clear that that the police were being so aggressive with it that there were some folks that were criminals, that were doing some really problematic, dangerous, horrible crimes. But then there was the broader community, and there was so many people that were connected to those folks, but they were and they were not doing any of that stuff, or they were just breaking curfew or, doing something that kids do. And they're kind of putting it under this whole umbrella of the Kurdish Pride Gang. And so that telling the story of the gang is not just saying like, oh, there were some bad things happening. It's telling the story of how the police treated this group of people in this moment and how it did legitimately have things to investigate, but that it also got very aggressive and very heavy-handed.
When did the sort of criminal activity sort of go away? I mean, in my mind, I haven't heard about the Kurdish Pride Gang in, 10 plus years maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it really just kind of vaporized. I mean, it really was kind of this blip, this moment. And I think what you see is that maybe some of that criminal behavior was not necessarily like we're part of a gang. It was like, there's just bad apples, like there's just people that are making poor choices. But because they're affiliated with this really, tight-knit community, suddenly that community takes on all of those actions in a way that like maybe you and me as just, white Americans, like we might not have that, right? Because Right.
It just looks like we're into mischief, not having to explain it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't have, but anyway, but all that to say, like, the thing about the Kurds that I loved learning about was just how tight knit they were and how everybody knew each other, and how in part it was because they had fled together. They had ended up in these refugee camps together, and they'd been relocated and resettled together. So yes, like, all of that created these amazing, intense, tight bonds. But then when something like this kind of starts to inject itself into it, it's still, those bonds still stay, and so it can have a negative effect.
Yeah. Obviously, this is a project you've been working on for a year, perhaps a little more than a year. But this episode in particular, what kind of challenges did you all run into researching this episode?
Yeah, we didn't have any problem with getting folks like Iran to talk about that part of his life, or getting folks like members of the community to talk about it. Surprisingly, it was really, really hard to get the detective. There was one detective, as we mentioned, Mark Anderson, who was a big part of all of these cases, who really spearheaded them, and he did not want to talk to us. So that was tough, because we really wanted to get the law enforcement perspective. We really wanted to understand, like, what their mission was, what kind of, what were they hoping to accomplish by kind of scooping up so many low-level crimes and mushing them into these very serious crimes. But we weren't able to get that perspective as fully as we wanted to get it.
Well, and I recall, though, I think this was this when police chief was Ronald Surpass?
I believe so, yeah.
And I think that it was at a time when there was a different kind of policing going on, right? Kind of that, you know more about this than me, but the sort of the broken windows.
I was just going to say broken windows. Yeah. I mean, Iran talks about kind of playing pickup basketball, and how, police officers would just kind of post up at the games and like sit there waiting. And it was very much this attitude of we're going to get all the small things. We're going to make sure. And it did have this feeling, I think, from our interviews, that there was kind of almost like a surveillance going on. Like, we are watching you.
Right. Maybe not particularly hostile, but sort of this was the way to tamp down anything that could get out of hand or get more violent.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that a TSU professor comes in who's trying to help them, and they're like, oh yeah, your son's on our radar. I mean, how to get on their radar? I don't know. Maybe every young Kurdish man was on their radar? I don't know.
Well, but do we really think that there's a security concern, and that's why someone wouldn't want to talk about it? Or that that policing has changed enough that one might not be as proud of this bit of one's history?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't pretend to understand what's in his mind, but I will say that looking at this intensely, as Rose and I did, it doesn't age very well.
Yeah.
When you look at one of the things in the episode is about this lawsuit, that was this first of its kind.
I had forgotten about it.
Yeah, the Metro lawsuit that they, this big lawsuit that they filed against the Kurdish Pride gang as a nuisance. And when you look at the list of like allegations, I mean, yes, there is very serious stuff in there, but it just is like, so much of it is like this piddly little thing, piddly little things. But when you put it all together, it's like, I mean, I could imagine you could do a version of that lawsuit for almost anybody if you broadened it out that much. And it was just such a, when you read it, you just think this is very heavy-handed.
Yeah, and probably wouldn't happen today.
Yeah.
Last thing, how does this episode, which is really about cultural assimilation, connect to maybe our current moment, which is not the same, but not too different?
Well, it really is kind of the runway for episode 4, which is all about like this moment. But it does create a really interesting contrast to kind of what was happening in the 90s and the early 2000s and what was a concern to folks then. And you can't help but kind of think about what is the concern now, and what is the climate of the country now, and what is it like for a young person coming of age in this country right now as an immigrant. I will say, I think, it's not just Metro Police that might be breathing down your neck. I think there's a lot of law enforcement agencies, right, that are looking at immigrants in a different way. So it does kind of tee up the 4th episode, which is really all about this very moment in this country and in this city.
Well, thank you for sharing. Maribel Knight is editor and co-producer of The Country in Our Hearts. I'm Blake Farmer, and this is Nashville, a production of Nashville Public Radio. Liv Lombardi is our technical director. Now, why don't we roll those podcast credits?
Next time on the final episode of The Country in Our Hearts, Episode 4, The Kurdish-American Dream.
They would just tell them pretty much like that America is a land of opportunities. There's much you can get from it.
I am worried that if I go to Turkey, first of all, they will put me in jail.
Traffic stops over the weekend led to ICE detainments in Nashville.
These kids will be American. They will be raised here and they will serve the United States.
You know, the tunnel's dark. Kurds have a dark history of, pain and suffering. But there's always light, Navruz.
The Country in Our Hearts was reported and produced by me, Rose Gilbert. My editor and co-producer was Maraba Knight, who spent a lot of time with me digging through court records. Additional editing by Tony Gonzalez, LaTanya Turner, and Rachel Iacovone, with help from Mariana Bacallao, Char Daston, and Justin Barney. Mac Limbaugh is Nashville Public Radio's Vice President of Audience and supported this project in many ways. Our community and cultural advisors on this project were Dr. David Romano and Dilman Yassin. Sound design was done by Martin Cruz, fact-checking by Daniel Potter, and original logo artwork is by Nuveen Badwadi. Traditional music is by Arkan Doski, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Paul McAdoo, Jennifer Nelson, and Samantha Max.